You know, you're probably used to looking at a calendar as just like a mundane grid of
Right,
boxes.
just a functional tool.
Yeah, exactly. It's purely functional. You have, I don't know, a dentist appointment on Tuesday, a project deadline on Thursday, maybe dinner plans Friday.
Just a way to track the week.
Right. It's just this sequential method for tracking the passing of your own personal time. And we tend to assume history simply marches forward day by day in this straight line.
But if you step into the intricate world of biblical eschatology, which is, the study of the end times,
Mm.
that calendar ceases to be a simple record of passing days.
It totally changes.
It really does. In certain theological frameworks, history isn't a straight line at all. It is viewed as this encrypted, repeating loop.
Like patterns happening over and over.
Precisely. Ancient festival dates and historical events are interpreted as a literal countdown to an imminent, pre-written cosmic conclusion.
Which brings us to the core mystery of today's deep dive. When most people hear the term the rapture, they picture, well, a single global cataclysmic event, right?
Yeah, one sudden moment where believers just vanish from the earth, leaving everyone else behind.
Exactly. But what if that assumption is entirely wrong? What if a deeper reading of the text reveals not one, but, and get this, 7 distinct raptures?
It's a staggering concept. And mapping out those 7 events requires looking at Scripture through a highly specific, highly detailed chronological lens.
And our source for this exhaustive study today is a comprehensive series of transcripts from the YouTube channel called Bible Believers Ministries India.
Right. They've produced this massive body of work detailing a prophetic calendar, decoding the underlying meaning of Old Testament feasts, and, well, constructing a remarkably precise timeline regarding the end of the world.
And for you listening, whether you're commuting, working out, or just insanely curious about how these intricate theological maps are built, we want to let you know that a link to the source for this study is located right below the video.
We definitely encourage you to check it out.
For sure. Now, because this source material touches on politically charged topics, I mean, everything from the United Nations to global health mandates and specific religious groups, we are approaching this strictly as an impartial analytical study.
Right. We aren't here to take sides or, endorse a timeline or make theological declarations.
Exactly. Our mission is to just act as your guides, deconstructing the presenter's arguments and showing you the fascinating mechanisms of how they arrive at their conclusions based on their specific interpretation of Scripture.
And the foundational premise of the channel's transcripts is that the widespread confusion, and there's endless debate among modern Christians regarding the end times, well, the source argues it all stems from a single catastrophic error.
Which is what?
The failure to recognize those multiple distinct raptures. By tracing the etymology and the conceptual pattern of being snatched away through the biblical text, their eschatological maps suggest there are actually 7 of them throughout history.
Which is wild because the word itself, rapture, isn't even in the English Bible, which is always like the first hurdle people encounter when talking about this.
Right, that trips a lot of people up.
Yeah, but tracing it back to the Latin rapturo, it literally means to be caught up or snatched away by force?
Exactly. And the channel's thesis lays out this specific sequence. First, you have the ancient patriarch Enoch, taken before the Great Flood.
Okay, that's one.
Second, the prophet Elijah, taken in a whirlwind. Third, Jesus and a specific group of Old Testament saints ascending after the resurrection.
Oh, the Old Testament saints, right?
Yeah. Fourth, the Apostle Paul's temporary translation to the third heaven. Fifth, the massive future rapture of the Christian church. Sixth, a mid-tribulation rapture involving Jewish saints. And finally, a 7th post-tribulation rapture.
That is a lot to keep straight. But structuring history into these distinct events is entirely dependent on this theological framework known as dispensationalism, right?
Yes, that is the crucial lens here. The phrase the presenter heavily emphasizes is rightly dividing the word of truth.
What does that mean in this context?
Well, in dispensationalism, the core idea is that God interacts with humanity using different rules or, dispensations during different eras of human history.
So, like, the rules change depending on what era you're born in.
Exactly. The rules for national Israel under the Mosaic Law in the Old Testament are not the same rules applied to the modern Christian church under grace.
I find it helps to visualize this as a massive 3-act stage play. It makes the mechanics of their argument much clearer.
Oh, that's a great analogy. Walk us through it.
Okay, so imagine you are an actor on stage right now. You're performing in Act 2, which represents the current church age.
Okay, I'm with you.
But somehow you accidentally pick up the script notes and stage directions for Act 3.
Yeah.
And Act 3 represents the tribulation, this prophesied future period of unprecedented global catastrophe.
Right, the terrifying stuff.
Yeah. If you start applying the horrifying stage directions from Act 3 to your current performance in Act 2, the entire play falls apart. You end up bracing yourself for a tragic scene of judgment and wrath when your actual script says you are scheduled for a rescue.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the presenter's view on why the church will not experience the tribulation.
Because they're just not in that act.
Exactly. In their timeline, the actors of Act 2 are completely removed from the stage before the curtain even rises on Act 3. The chronological blueprint is super rigid.
So it's a strict sequence.
Very strict. A pre-tribulation rapture of the church initiates a devastating 7-year tribulation on earth, which is often referred to in the source as the time of Jacob's trouble.
And that period is divided up, right?
Right. It's divided into 2 3.5-year halves, culminating in the second advent, which is Jesus physically returning to earth, followed by a literal 1,000-year millennial reign of global peace.
So if the church is entirely out of the picture during Act 3, that must mean all those terrifying Old Testament prophecies about the day of the Lord, the fire, the judgment, the wrath, aren't actually aimed at Christians at all.
According to this framework, no, they aren't.
They must be aimed at a different group entirely. Is that the mechanism the source uses to separate the day of the Lord from the day of Christ?
Precisely. The transcripts argue that conflating those two phrases is a major source of modern theological error.
Interesting. How do they separate them?
Well, the day of the Lord is heavily established by Old Testament prophets as a time of severe earthly upheaval, judgment, and wrath aimed at the unsaved world and national Israel, basically meant to drive them to repentance.
Okay, so that's earthly and chaotic.
Yes. Conversely, the day of Christ is an entirely separate heavenly event. It refers to the rapture of the church and the subsequent judgment seat of Christ, where believers are evaluated and rewarded.
So the church participates exclusively in the day of Christ in heaven, while the world endures the day of the Lord on earth.
That is the presenter's exact argument.
But, if the English word rapture is absent and you're building a massive framework claiming there are exactly 7 of these events, you can't just pull that out of thin air.
No, you need a foundation.
Right, there has to be a cipher. And looking at the source material, their cipher is something called biblical types. They aren't treating Old Testament stories as, moral fables or allegories.
Not at all.
They are treating them as encrypted blueprints.
And typology is the engine driving this entire study. The premise here relies on the belief that God authored history itself to serve as prophecy.
That's a huge concept.
It is. A type is a historical event, person, or institution that serves as a prophetic shadow of a future reality. So to understand what the future rapture of the church looks like, the source argues you must look backward at the raptures or redemptive events that have already been recorded.
It's kind of like looking at a fractal in mathematics.
A fractal? How so?
Well, a fractal is this complex geometric pattern that repeats itself at every single scale. Whether you zoom all the way in on a microscope or zoom all the way out to a galaxy, you see the exact same shape.
Oh, I see.
The presenter basically treats scripture as a divine fractal. So let's look at how they apply this to the very beginning, like with Adam.
Right. So in this framework, the first man, Adam, is viewed as a definitive type representing Christ. The source zeroes in on the specific mechanics of Eve's creation in the book of Genesis.
Okay.
God puts Adam into a deep sleep. And throughout biblical poetry and prophecy, sleep is consistently used as a type for death.
Right, that metaphor shows up all the time.
Exactly. So while Adam is submerged in this death-like state, his side is physically opened, and a rib is extracted to form his bride.
And they map this directly to the crucifixion.
Yes, Jesus is put into the sleep of death on the cross. His side is physically pierced by a Roman spear, and it is through this shedding of blood that he spiritually purchases his bride, the church.
The symmetry there is genuinely fascinating, but it gets incredibly granular when the source moves to Isaac.
Isaac is a massive part of this study.
Yeah, because if Adam represents Christ purchasing the bride, the source argues Isaac represents Christ actually receiving the bride.
And the details of that story are highly specific.
Very. The presenter focuses on Genesis 24, where Isaac's father sends a servant to find a bride for his son. As the bride, Rebekah, is traveling back, Isaac goes out into the field to meditate and meet her.
But there's a timestamp on that, isn't there?
Yes. The detail the source elevates above all others is the specific time of day. It happens explicitly at eventide, or around 6 p.m.
And to a casual reader, Isaac meditating at 6 p.m. is just a piece of historical trivia. Like, who cares what time he took a walk, right?
Exactly.
But through the lens of typology, it is viewed as a deliberate, highly calculated prophetic breadcrumb. The presenter connects that evening hour directly to the timeline of Christ.
How does that line up?
Based on their reading of the Jewish agrarian calendar and the gospel accounts, Jesus was buried right around 6 p.m. on the day of Passover, and he resurrected at 6 p.m. days later.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, the source proposes that this recurring 6 p.m. timestamp might actually hint at the exact Jewish hour when the future rapture of the church will be triggered.
Now, if you are listening to this, you might be raising an eyebrow.
It sounds a bit like a stretch to some, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
is Isaac taking an evening walk really a map to the end of the world? There's a psychological phenomenon called apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between completely unrelated things.
A human brain just finding patterns in chaos.
Right. So how does the presenter defend against the critique that they are just finding patterns in random historical data? Like, what stops someone from saying, well, Rebecca was riding a camel, so the rapture must involve a UFO?
That is a vital critique, and the channel's defense relies heavily on the concept of New Testament validation.
Validation.
Right. They argue they are not just inventing these types in a vacuum. They look for moments where a historical Old Testament detail perfectly aligns with a concrete doctrinal truth taught by Jesus or the apostles later on.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. For instance, Jesus himself explicitly compares the conditions of the end times to the days of Noah. By doing so, the source argues, he retroactively validates the entire flood narrative as a prophetic type.
Which perfectly brings us to the first two raptures on their list, Enoch and Elijah. The timing of their departures is literally everything to this framework.
Timing is the whole point.
Yeah. Enoch is a man who walked with God and was translated or raptured before the floodwaters ever fell.
Right, he misses the judgment completely.
Exactly. So if the flood is the ultimate biblical type for the catastrophic judgment of the tribulation, then Enoch being removed beforehand makes him the definitive historical type for the pre-tribulation rapture of the Christian church.
But then you look at Elijah, and the fractal changes shape. Elijah does not escape the trouble. He lives through 3.5 years of severe, deadly drought and famine under the reign of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel.
3.5 years, that's a very specific number.
It is, and the transcripts argue that Ahab is a clear historical type for the future Antichrist, and Jezebel represents the false global religious system described in Revelation as Mystery Babylon.
So they are types for the villains of the end times.
Exactly. Elijah endures this specific 3.5-year period of persecution, and he is only raptured in a whirlwind after the famine ends.
And because the book of Revelation explicitly dictates that the Great Tribulation, the worst period of the Antichrist's reign, lasts exactly 3.5 years, the math lines up perfectly.
It aligns seamlessly for them.
So the source deduces that Elijah cannot represent the church. He must represent a different group of saints, primarily Jewish believers, who endure the wrath of the Antichrist and are raptured just prior to the second coming.
It's a really compelling way to use ancient history to resolve a modern theological debate about timelines.
It is. Now, building on these historical figures, the study then transitions into a massive cosmic event that bridges the Old and New Testaments.
This would be the third rapture in their sequence.
Yes, and it requires exploring the supernatural mechanics of the afterlife as understood in ancient biblical cosmology. This part of the deep dive feels like unpacking a supernatural heist.
A supernatural heist. I love that.
Seriously, we're talking about the 3 days and 3 nights between the crucifixion and the resurrection. A lot of modern theology just glides over this, assuming Jesus was simply resting in the tomb.
But the source disagrees.
Vehemently. Drawing heavily on Ephesians 4 and 1 Peter 3, the presenter argues emphatically that Jesus was incredibly active. He descended into the lower parts of the earth. So we have to map out the geography of the underworld, or Sheol, as the presenter understands it.
Right, so imagine a vast subterranean realm divided straight down the middle by an uncrossable, bottomless chasm.
Like a massive canyon.
Exactly. On one side, you have hell, or Tartarus, a place of darkness where the souls of the unsaved are kept in torment. But on the opposite side of that chasm, you have a place of comfort, light, and waiting, referred to in Scripture as paradise, or Abraham's bosom.
The obvious question for anyone listening is, Why would righteous people like Abraham, Moses, or King David be in the underworld at all? Why wouldn't they just go straight to heaven when they died?
It's a great question, and the presenter's explanation hinges on the mechanics of the Old Testament sacrificial system.
How does that work?
Well, the blood of bulls and goats sacrificed on Jewish altars could only cover sins temporarily. The source argues it did not possess the spiritual power to permanently wash them away.
So they were basically in a holding pattern.
Exactly. Because God is entirely holy, a soul with covered but not cleansed sin could not enter his presence in the third heaven. Therefore, those Old Testament saints were held in a state of restful captivity in paradise, literally waiting for centuries for the true Messiah to arrive and pay the ultimate permanent price.
Okay, so when Jesus dies on the cross, his spirit descends into the subterranean realm. The transcripts detail that he first crosses into the side of torment, specifically a prison holding fallen angels from the days of Noah.
But he doesn't go there to suffer.
No. And he doesn't go to evangelize them either. The source says he goes to proclaim his absolute cosmic victory over death.
Right, it's a declaration of triumph.
And after declaring victory in the abyss, Jesus crosses over the chasm into paradise. This is the heist part.
I see where you're going.
He stands before thousands of years' worth of captive saints and essentially says, the price is paid, the blood has been shed. When Jesus resurrects on the third day, the source argues he doesn't leave them behind.
He takes them with him.
He empties paradise completely. He takes captivity captive, leading this massive host of Old Testament saints out of the center of the earth and ascending with them to the third heaven. This mass supernatural migration is what the channel defines as the third rapture.
And to validate the physical reality of this event, the presenter points to a highly unusual and honestly frequently overlooked passage in Matthew 27.
What does it say?
The text states that immediately following Jesus' resurrection, many bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the graves and went into the holy city and appeared unto many.
Okay, I have to pause and push back on the precise wording there. The text says many bodies arose. It doesn't say all bodies arose.
That's a very sharp distinction.
If Jesus completely emptied paradise of every single Old Testament saint, why did only a fraction of them get their physical bodies back to walk around Jerusalem? Like, what happened to the rest of them? Did they just ascend as ghosts?
That is a critical distinction.
Yeah.
And the expert analysis from the source tackles it directly. Their eschatological map suggests that Jesus absolutely took the souls of every single Old Testament saint to heaven, permanently closing down the paradise compartment of Sheol. However, only a select group, the many mentioned in Matthew, were granted their resurrected physical bodies right then and there as a testimony to the physical reality of Christ's victory.
So they were like a physical proof.
Yes. And the presenter speculates this specific group might have been the saints who lived and died strictly under the Mosaic law. As for the rest, the patriarchs from before the law, for example, they ascended as spirits.
So they are still waiting for bodies.
According to the source, yes. They argue that those remaining spirits will finally receive their glorified physical bodies at a future resurrection, specifically corresponding with the second coming, so they can rule on earth during the millennium.
Okay, so if the lives of historical figures give us the what and the how, the presenter then argues that the ancient Jewish agricultural calendar gives us the when.
Right, moving from types to timelines.
Exactly. They point to Leviticus 23, where God institutes 7 annual feasts for the nation of Israel. But they aren't treating these just as ancient harvest festivals. They are treating them as a rigid, unalterable, chronological timeline of God's redemptive plan for humanity.
The source approaches the 7 feasts, which are Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles, with a 3-tiered interpretive lens.
A 3-tiered lens. Okay.
First, they have a historical fulfillment for the nation of Israel. Second, they have a spiritual application for the individual Christian believer. And third, and most importantly for this study, they have a future macro-prophetic fulfillment regarding the end of the world.
And the presenter places enormous weight on the 3 mandatory feasts where God commanded all Jewish males to physically travel and appear before him in Jerusalem.
The logic there is fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. The presenter connects the ancient earthly requirement of appearing before God in Jerusalem to a future spiritual reality. Believers literally appearing before God in heaven via a rapture.
So let's unpack how the source maps these 3 major feasts to their prophetic timeline, starting in the spring with Passover.
Okay, historically, Passover celebrates the night the angel of death passed over the Israelite homes marked by the blood of the Lamb, right? triggering their deliverance from slavery in Egypt under Pharaoh.
Prophetically, the source maps Passover directly to the future pre-tribulation rapture of the church. The typological parallels are extremely dense here.
How so?
Well, Egypt is consistently used in Scripture as a type for the sinful world system, and Pharaoh is a type for the devil. Just as God delivered his people from the world system of Egypt on Passover, the presenter argues God will deliver the church from the modern world system via the rapture on a future Passover.
They also layer in the imagery we discussed earlier regarding the 6:00 p.m. timeline. The original Passover lambs were commanded to be slaughtered at eventide.
Right, tying it back to Isaac.
Furthermore, the source leans heavily into the poetic imagery of the Song of Solomon, where the heavenly bridegroom calls his bride away, specifically in the springtime, noting that the winter is past and the flowers have appeared.
It's highly evocative.
It's like an encrypted divine alarm clock, where the hands aren't made of numbers, but of changing seasons and harvest cycles. If you understand the agriculture, you know exactly what time it is on God's clock.
Which brings us to the second mandatory feast, Pentecost, also known as the Feast of Weeks. This occurs roughly 50 days after the Feast of First Fruits.
But the agricultural mechanics of Pentecost are totally unique, right?
They are. Unlike Passover, which is locked to a hard numerical calendar date, the exact day of Pentecost in ancient Israel was somewhat fluid.
How could a feast date be fluid?
The source emphasizes that the Levitical priests had to physically go out into the field and watch the wheat crop. They had to wait for the specific moment the ears of corn formed on the stalk before they could put the sickle to the harvest and initiate the final 50-day countdown.
Because Pentecost inherently requires this active, physical watching of the crop, the presenter aligns it with a completely different prophetic event. They map Pentecost to a mid-tribulation rapture.
Right.
But wait, if the church is already gone during the spring at Passover, who is left to be raptured in the middle of the tribulation?
This is where the channel's distinction between different groups of saints becomes crucial. They teach that after the church is removed, a specific group of Jewish believers, often identified in their transcripts as the 144,000 from the book of Revelation or the symbolic man-child of Revelation 12, will be activated.
Debated to do what?
To preach the gospel of the coming kingdom during the terrifying first half of the tribulation. Because these Jewish saints are physically on earth navigating this horrific global dictatorship, they are explicitly commanded by God to watch for the signs of the times, mirroring the priests watching the wheat.
Oh, I see the parallel.
The presenter posits that these Jewish evangelists will be raptured in the middle of the 7-year period, rescuing them before the Antichrist unleashes his most extreme persecution.
So Passover handles the church rapture, and Pentecost handles the mid-tribulation Jewish rapture. That leaves the final cluster of feasts occurring in the autumn: trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. How does the source resolve the end of the timeline?
Well, the Feast of Trumpets symbolizes two massive events in their framework. First, a trumpet sounding to gather an assembly, which they map to the miraculous geopolitical regathering of the nation of Israel in 1948.
Okay, that's historical for us now.
Yes. Second, a trumpet sounding an alarm of war, which they believe points to the exact midpoint of the tribulation when the Antichrist desecrates the rebuilt Jewish temple, forcing the Jewish people to flee into the wilderness for survival.
That terrifying flight into the wilderness is immediately followed by the Day of Atonement, historically the most solemn fasting day of the Jewish year.
And the presenter maps this to the severe chastisement and unparalleled suffering of the Jewish people during the second half of the tribulation. They view it as a brutal but necessary crucible for national purification and spiritual awakening.
And that crucible ends with the third and final mandatory feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Ingathering. Historically, this was a massive, joyous celebration, marking the absolute end of the agricultural harvest.
The Israelites would live in temporary booths to remember God's provision in the wilderness.
Prophetically, the source maps tabernacles to the ultimate climax of the story: the post-tribulation rapture of the remaining tribulation saints, the physical second advent of Jesus returning in the clouds, and the joyful inauguration of the 1,000-year millennial reign.
The fasting and mourning of atonement transforms into the ultimate gladness of tabernacles.
Now, mapping seasons to events is one thing, but the transcripts go a step further. They actually do the math to project potential modern calendar years, and this is where it gets highly controversial.
It always gets controversial when dates get involved.
Oh, absolutely. Their premise is based on the idea that human history is a 7,000-year master plan. intentionally designed to mirror the 7 days of creation in Genesis, where a day equals 1,000 years. So you have roughly 4,000 years of Old Testament history, 2,000 years for the church age, and 1,000 years for the millennial reign of rest.
Following that mathematical logic, the presenter calculates that if Jesus was crucified and resurrected around the year 30 AD, a precise 2,000-year church age brings the timeline exactly to the year 2030 for the second coming of Christ to end the tribulation.
But they don't stop there. They trace the logic backward to figure out when the rapture could occur.
Right, because the tribulation is 7 years long.
But the source introduces a fascinating nuance. They suggest there might be a buffer period following the rapture of the church, a gap of time before the Antichrist actually rises to power and signs the global peace treaty that officially starts the 7-year tribulation clock.
A gap. On what basis?
To justify this gap, they point to a specific verse, Revelation 2.0, which mentions a period of tribulation 10 days. In biblical prophecy, a day is frequently used to symbolize a year. So if there is a 10-year gap between the church rapture and the second coming in 2030, the source mathematically deduces that the window for the rapture actually opened around the year 2020.
It is a stunningly precise calculation, and the presenter presents it not as a guess, but as the logical mathematical conclusion of overlaying the Levitical feasts onto the 7,000-year framework.
But I have to throw the biggest, most obvious theological wrench into these gears.
Let's hear it.
Anyone who has spent even a little time in Sunday school knows the famous red letter quote from Jesus regarding the end times. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only.
A very famous verse.
How does a source dedicated to literal biblical interpretation justify mapping Old Testament festival dates to specific modern calendar years like 2020 or 2030? Doesn't doing the math explicitly contradict the core text?
The presenter addresses that apparent contradiction head-on, arguing that the warning, "No man knows the day or the hour," has been entirely ripped out of context by the modern church.
Ripped out of context? How?
Their defense is twofold. First, they argue that when Jesus said that in Matthew 24, he was speaking specifically to a Jewish audience about the second advent at the end of the tribulation, not to the church about the rapture.
Okay, going back to dispensationalism.
Right. Second, they propose it may have been a well-known Jewish idiom referring specifically to the Feast of Trumpets, a holiday whose start could never be mathematically predicted because it relied on two witnesses physically sighting the sliver of the new moon.
So they argued Jesus was using a cultural code word, not issuing a blanket prohibition on chronological study.
Exactly.
And they heavily lean on the Apostle Paul to back this up. Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 5, speaking directly to Christians, "But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief."
Yes, that verse is central to their argument.
The source fiercely believes that while the exact millisecond might be hidden, believers who diligently study the agricultural types, the feast dates, and the prophetic slivens are absolutely fundamentally meant to know the precise time frame of their departure. You aren't supposed to be surprised.
Which transitions seamlessly into how the source believes a Christian should actually live out their daily life while waiting. You don't just sit in a bunker staring at the sky. You actively watch the signs.
Like tracking the seasons.
Exactly. To map out exactly where we are on the timeline, they utilize the 4 biblical night watches, evening, midnight, cockcrow, and morning, overlaying them with the 4 prophetic seasons of winter, spring, summer, and fall.
When outlining the specific chronological sequence leading up to the church rapture, the transcripts rely heavily on the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. Jesus lays out a very specific sequence of dominoes that must fall before the tribulation begins.
What's the first domino?
The first domino is a period of massive, systemic spiritual deception, which the source specifically links to the corruption and alteration of foundational biblical texts.
Interesting. The second domino is the rise of false Christs. And the source defines this much more broadly than a crazy person claiming to literally be Jesus of Nazareth.
Oh, how do they define it?
In their framework, a false Christ is any religious leader, institution, or movement, from the papacy to modern prosperity gospel preachers, that positions itself as the necessary mediator between God and man, attempting to usurp the exclusive role of Jesus.
And the third major sign before the rapture is wars and rumors of wars. The source points to the unprecedented, mechanized global conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries as the ultimate fulfillment of this.
The scale of war has definitely changed.
But the key to their timeline is Jesus' reassurance. "See that ye be not troubled, for For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. In this framework, the end specifically refers to the tribulation.
Right.
So you have a sequence of spiritual deception, false religious mediators, and devastating global wars. And then, according to the presenter, right at the peak of that exhaustion comes the rapture.
The way the source maps the immediate aftermath of the rapture to the events of Revelation 6 is fascinating. Immediately following the removal of the church, the first seal is opened, and the Antichrist appears, riding a white horse.
And a white horse is a universal symbol of peace.
Yes. The channel argues that the global population will be utterly traumatized and exhausted by the preceding century of wars and rumors of wars. This trauma creates an intense, desperate global demand for a charismatic peacemaker.
The Antichrist steps onto the world stage and fulfills this demand by confirming a magnificent 7-year peace covenant, particularly focused on the Middle East and Israel.
But the source emphasizes that this peace is a total deception and incredibly short-lived.
Because right behind the white horse comes the rider on the red horse, symbolizing the removal of peace from the earth and the outbreak of a massive catastrophic global war.
Which the presenter links directly to the prophesied multi-nation invasion of Israel described in Ezekiel 38, often called the War of Gog and Magog.
Understanding this sequence is meant to provide profound psychological comfort to the channel's audience. The transcripts adamantly reassure their listeners that true, born-again Christians will entirely escape the wrath of this chaotic period.
So they don't face the red horse at all.
No. When the pre-tribulation rapture occurs, believers bypass the earthly horrors of the Antichrist and transition immediately to a heavenly event called the judgment seat of Christ.
I want to clarify the mechanics of that judgment, because the word judgment usually terrifies people.
It definitely sounds intimidating.
The source stresses that for the raptured believer, this event is not a trial to determine salvation. In their theology, salvation is a free gift entirely secured by faith, decided the moment a person believes.
So what are they being judged on?
The judgment seat of Christ is purely an evaluation of the believer's earthly works, actions, and motivations for the sole purpose of distributing heavenly rewards.
However, this raises a massive debate within eschatological circles. Does every Christian get raptured regardless of how lazily or poorly they live their earthly life?
Ah, the partial rapture theory.
Yes. Or is it a partial rapture, where only the super holy, fiercely dedicated, radically obedient Christians are taken, while the lukewarm believers are left behind to face the music of the Antichrist?
It's a terrifying thought. But the presenter vehemently opposes the partial rapture theory. They state unequivocally that every single person who is truly saved and part of the body of Christ will be caught up in the pre-tribulation rapture, completely irrespective of their spiritual maturity or earthly performance.
Why are they so against it?
Their argument is that teaching a partial rapture functionally turns salvation back into a works-based system, which violates the core of their grace-based theology. Every true believer goes.
Even if they lived a terrible life.
If a Christian lived a terrible, unfruitful life, the consequence isn't being abandoned to the tribulation. The consequence is a devastating loss of eternal rewards at the judgment seat in heaven.
This total inclusion is exactly why the channel insists the phrase thief in the night is so deeply misunderstood by modern Christianity.
Because if you are a believer, they argue, you are fundamentally awake.
Right. You are studying the types, you understand the agrarian calendar, you see the geopolitical signs. The rapture is not supposed to catch you off guard.
It shouldn't be a surprise.
The thief in the night scenario, in their framework, applies strictly and exclusively to the unsaved world. The secular world will be celebrating the Antichrist, crying peace and safety, and that is when sudden, inescapable destruction will fall upon them like a thief breaking into a house.
Which brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most provocative segment of this deep dive. Moving from ancient biblical theory to the present day, how does the source interpret current, tangible global events as the final setting of the stage?
The presenter is absolutely emphatic about this. The infrastructure required for the Antichrist's totalitarian reign is not some futuristic sci-fi concept. It is completely assembled, tested, and operational right now.
Let's impartially map out their specific views on modern headlines, starting in the Middle East with the Third Temple. For the Antichrist to commit the ultimate blasphemy, desecrating the Jewish temple in the middle of the tribulation, a temple must physically exist on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
And there isn't one there right now.
Exactly. The transcripts meticulously track current efforts by temple institutes in Israel, who have fully designed the architectural plans, woven the priestly garments, and most importantly, sourced genetically perfect red heifers from ranches in the United States.
Wait, why cows from Texas?
Because according to a highly specific Old Testament law in the book of Numbers, the ashes of a completely flawless, unblemished red heifer that has never worn a yoke are absolutely required to ritually purify the Temple Mount before any construction can begin or priests can minister.
Wow, okay.
The presenter notes that these heifers have a very limited biological time frame. They must be sacrificed at a specific age before they grow too old or develop a blemish.
So there's a literal ticking clock on these cows.
Yes. The source links the urgency of this impending sacrifice to the 2030 calculations we discussed earlier, suggesting a theoretical timeline where a rebuilt third temple could be fully dedicated by the end of the decade.
And they are quick to point out how seamlessly this timeline aligns with the target dates of major secular global initiatives like the United Nations Agenda 2030 and the World Economic Forum's Great Reset.
Geopolitically, the presenter views recent diplomatic maneuvers, specifically the Abraham Accords and various UN-sponsored peace summits, as the foundational blueprint for the Antichrist's rise.
In their eschatological framework, the globe is currently drowning in the prophesied era of wars and rumors of wars.
And that exhaustion plays a part.
The ensuing global economic and psychological exhaustion is actively preparing the global populace to eagerly accept a radical, all-encompassing 7-year peace covenant, which the Antichrist will either personally broker or forcefully confirm, thereby triggering the official start of the tribulation.
The transcripts then pivot to what they term beast technology. And we are reporting this impartially, as the channel's stated viewpoint.
Of course.
The presenter views recent global pandemics, lockdowns, and digital health mandates not merely as responses to public health crises, but as deliberate global trial runs for the eventual implementation of the mark of the beast.
They see it as a beta test.
The source argues that the vast digital and technological infrastructure required to track human movement, control biometric data, and dictate buying and selling, exactly as described in Revelation 13, has now been successfully beta tested on a global scale and is fully operational, just waiting for the right dictator to take the helm.
But the most surreal and intense part of their modern analysis involves CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research.
This part is wild.
The presenter does not view the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland as merely a massive scientific instrument for studying particle physics. Through their prophetic lens, it is a literal attempt by mankind to open dimensional doors or portals to the supernatural realm, specifically the bottomless pit mentioned in Revelation.
Now, if you're listening to this on your commute, you might be rolling your eyes right now. The Pope, CERN, dimensional portals. It sounds exactly like the plot of a late-night sci-fi movie or a Dan Brown novel.
It really does.
But the reason it is so crucial to unpack this is to understand the absolute totality of the source's worldview. They believe the spiritual realm is constantly bleeding into the physical realm through symbols.
Like what kind of symbols?
Well, they point out that the CERN logo contains overlapping circles that allegedly form the number 666. Furthermore, they highlight the fact that a large statue of the Hindu deity Shiva, known as the Destroyer, sits prominently outside the CERN headquarters.
Oh, wow.
The source directly and literally equates Shiva to Apollyon, the demonic biblical angel who is named as the king of the bottomless pit in Revelation 9.
To further solidify this supernatural, cross-dimensional interpretation, the presenter connects CERN's scientific activities to a highly symbolic religious act performed by the Pope. The transcripts describe a recent Jubilee event where the Pope opened a physical, holy door located within a prism.
And they don't see that as just a nice gesture.
No. The presenter interprets this not as a gesture of grace for inmates, but as a dark prophetic mirroring. They believe the Pope was spiritually and symbolically enacting the opening of the gates of hell, preparing the way for the demonic entities of the bottomless pit, the ancient spirits in prison we discussed during the Harrowing of Hell segment, to be unleashed upon the physical earth during the impending tribulation.
The picture they paint is like walking into a massive Broadway theater an hour before the show. The script was written thousands of years ago. The elaborate sets, the digital tracking tech, the UN peace summits are fully built.
The actors, the red heifers, the global politicians are in their costumes waiting in the wings.
The house lights are dimming. The play is absolutely inevitably about to begin.
But I have to ask the ultimate question for the skeptic. Given that literally every single generation of Christians for the last 2,000 years has looked at their own novel technology, their own devastating plagues, and their own terrifying geopolitical conflicts and thought, this is it, the end is definitely here, how does the source argue that this specific generation is truly different? Why isn't this just another false alarm?
The presenter's ultimate argument for the uniqueness of this generation rests on the convergence of all these factors around one specific, undeniable historical reality: the existence of national Israel.
Israel, right.
For nearly 1900 years, the nation of Israel simply did not exist on a map. The source argues that during that entire time, the prophetic clock was essentially paused. All previous generations who thought the end was near were mathematically wrong because the primary puzzle piece was missing.
But now that Israel is physically back in the land as of 1948, the clock has resumed.
Exactly. When you combine a reborn Israel with the modern technological capacity for absolute global financial control, the fever-pitched desire for a Middle East peace treaty, and the literal, physical preparations for the Third Temple, the presenter insists that the uniqueness of right now is historically unparalleled.
So it's the convergence.
Yes, in a sheer convergence of all the ancient biblical types and the chronological timelines points exclusively to this generation.
So let's zoom out and take a breath, because the scope of this study is absolutely staggering. We've navigated the presenter's intricate framework, proposing not one, but 7 distinct raptures.
We've explored the concept of biblical typology, examining how Adam's deep sleep and Isaac's evening bride serve as prophetic fractals.
We've mapped the agricultural mechanics of the 7 Levitical fields, exploring how the watching of the wheat at Pentecost and the joy of tabernacles point to pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, and post-accumulation raptures.
We've unpacked the night watches, the harrowing of hell, and seen how the source interprets everything from red heifers in Texas to the particle colliders at CERN as the final undeniable dressing of the global stage.
And we want to reiterate one final time the neutrality of this deep dive. Today has been a rigorous exploration of the specific, highly detailed eschatological framework presented by Bible Believers Ministries India.
We have unpacked the mechanisms of how they synthesize ancient history, agrarian laws, and current global events into a cohesive, meticulously timed, if highly debated, narrative of the end of the world.
Which leaves us with a profound philosophical question to mull over as we wrap up. We talked at the very beginning about looking at a calendar not as a mundane record of the past, but as a ticking countdown to an imminent pre-written cosmic conclusion. When a person genuinely adopts this framework, when they believe that human history is an encrypted, repeating loop, hurtling toward a predetermined, unalterable end, that the script is absolutely locked and the global actors are just hitting their marks, how does that change the way they live on a normal Tuesday afternoon?
It is the ultimate tension, isn't it? Does viewing the world as a ticking prophetic clock make a person more passive to global crises, believing war and tyranny to be inevitable, unstoppable steps toward the finish line?
Or does the certainty of that impending deadline make a person more urgently active with the fleeting time they believe they have left?
It's the profound tension between the immense comfort of knowing exactly how the story ends and the heavy burden of believing you are living in its final chaotic chapters.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.